Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Well, one thing we can now say about President Donald Trump, he will go down in history for taking away one guy's red card and for taking away a lot of people's green cards. Despite the red card intervention, as you probably know, the U.S. men's soccer team was eliminated from the World Cup last night by Belgium, perhaps with an assist from karma. Then there was the Supreme Court decision 2 weeks ago that didn't make as much news as some more high-profile ones. The court ruled 6-3 that green card holders can be denied re-entry into the United States if they have merely been accused of certain crimes. They don't have to have been convicted. The immigrant in question had been accused of selling counterfeit shorts in New Jersey. That case, known as Blanche versus Lau, is one of 7 contained in an article in The Nation about important Supreme Court rulings you probably missed by the nation's justice correspondent, Elie Mystal. Elie supports some of these rulings and opposes some of them, we should say. Elie, if you know his work, will certainly make his opinions clear. We'll also revisit some of the bombshell rulings you did hear about last week, like why Elie says the transgender rights case ruling goes way beyond sports. And back to the red card, green card, why he was rooting for Iran to win the World Cup. Spoiler alert, it's not because he supports their government. Elie Mystal is the nation's justice correspondent and a columnist. He is also an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center. He's the author of 2 books, the New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, and Bad Law, 10 popular laws that are ruining America. Elie, always good to get your take on things. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. How are you? I'm busy fighting apparently all Europeans over the validity of American soccer. So that's been fun.
What do you mean, validity?
Because the Europeans are just like, yeah, the U.S. was always trash. And I was like, no. We played like trash, but the team was actually good and really could have given Belgium a better game in different circumstances.
Well, you know, I definitely know Americans who might have been rooting hard for the U.S. team last night. It sounds like you maybe did not fall away from that, except they lost their enthusiasm because of Trump throwing his weight around with FIFA to reinstate that player who got suspended for a red card foul. It was probably a bad call by the refs, but nonetheless, I think the sports exception to political polarization, and there does seem to be one. We certainly saw it in New York with the Knicks. It didn't matter what you thought about Trump or Mamdani or anything. Everybody was wearing the orange and blue. That sports exception got spoiled, and what people think about Trump became a factor for many fans last night, I think. Any thought about that, or should we go right on to the Supreme Court?
I think it's the same thought, though. I think it's a perfect segue because what I saw from the admittedly corrupt decision by FIFA is that maybe people in the sports context can see that just because a judge or a body or an institution rules on something doesn't make that ruling right, doesn't make that ruling fair, and doesn't absolve that ruling from corruption. And to segue it into something that I think we'll talk about later, you get so many people who are just like, oh, see? Kicking trans people out of sports, that's not unconstitutional because the Supreme Court said so. Yeah. Check the source, right? Check which Supreme Court justices said that, right? And people need to. I thought it was karmically interesting that the most American way to play soccer involves suing to object to a bad call, right? And then getting a corrupt decision from a ruling body. Like that seems so very American to me in this moment.
And I did see after their win last night, the Belgian team put a 2-word post on social media, overturn this. But before we leave soccer, I do want to give you the chance to say why you were rooting for Iran, which, like the United States, has been eliminated. Why for their World Cup team?
Because their World Cup team was playing under the worst circumstances of any team in the tournament. First of all, their own government didn't let some of their best players play on their team because some of their best players were not sufficiently genuflecting to that government. Given where I live in this country, I can understand that. So they got screwed by their own government. Then our country, one of the host countries, starts an illegal, unconstitutional war against their country. That's not cool. Then, despite the fact that this World Cup was being hosted across 3 different nations in North America, the FIFA made Iran play all of its games here, which is ridiculous. And then this country refused to grant visas and travel permits to all of the team's staff and members. So that's ridiculous. And then when they were forced to base their team in Tijuana, fly to the U.S. for all their games, this country was forcing them to immediately fly back to Mexico after the game, not even allowing for the normal athletic recovery time overnight. You get your ice bath. No. None of that. As soon as the game is over, bam, they were back on a plane to Tijuana. That team played under ridiculously bad circumstances because of 3 governing bodies: Iran, the U.S., and FIFA. And I just wanted that. I so wanted that team to overcome that in any way they could. Just being here was overcoming some of those hurdles, and I wanted them to do as well as possible.
Talk about playing soccer with one leg tied behind your back. The one on that list that I didn't realize until I read it in your article was that all their games were scheduled for on U.S. soil, even though there were venues that were also hosting and are also hosting World Cup matches in Canada and Mexico. It's a North American, wide World Cup. Do you have any indication that FIFA did that, maybe at the request of Donald Trump, specifically to inconvenience the Iranian team as much as possible?
No, I don't. FIFA makes these schedules a long time out in advance, and they were just being inflexible and unreasonable about the situation. I think that's more on FIFA and less on direct U.S. corruption.
All right. Blanche versus Lau. Mook Choi Lau was a green card holder, a legal permanent resident who had briefly gone back to China, but when he tried to return to the United States, want to pick up the story from there?
Yeah, Brian, first of all, I'm so thankful that you are highlighting this particular story because it's honestly one of the worst decisions that happened in the last 2 weeks of the Supreme Court turn, and most people missed it, right? So yes, this Chinese, born Chinese national who has an American green card, so he's a legal person, permanent resident, gets charged with a counterfeiting charge, right? It's a crime. It's a minor non-violent crime, but he's charged with a crime. He pleads not guilty, and he returns to China to visit family, and then attempts to come home to the U.S. As he is allowed to do because he's a green card holder. He's stopped at the border by border officials who refused to allow him re-entry into the country because of this pending charge. Now, at the time that he was denied, this is just a charge. He's not been convicted of anything. Indeed, he's pleaded not guilty to this charge. Nonetheless, he's denied reentry, and told that to get back into the country, he has to apply for reentry as opposed to simply coming back because he's a permanent resident, right? They eventually parole him back into the country, specifically so he can resolve his court case. He ends up pleading guilty to the counterfeiting charge, which again is a crime. But that is not a crime, counterfeiting, that gets people deported, right? If you're a legal permanent resident, you can't be deported just because you've committed counterfeiting. However, because the man's status was changed from legal permanent resident to applying for reentry, counterfeiting is a charge that can get you denied a visa in the first place, if you will. And based on that, they kicked him out of the country. They deported him. He sued. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And 6-3, the court rules that, yeah, that's fine, that you can deny a person entry, not based on a crime, not based on any evidence of a crime, but based on mere charges, based on mere allegations. That is enough to kick a person to deny a person reentry to the country, and that you can be denied reentry even if you are a legal permanent resident. It is a gross and disgusting decision, and really shows just how extremist not only the Trump administration, but his cabal of justices on the Supreme Court. It shows how extremist they've become and uh, how much they disregard even the basic tenets and spirit of the laws.
You know, one of the reasons I keyed on this case is because it seems to me to have implications, at least, and you'll tell me if you think it establishes law in this respect, but implications beyond this case. Can someone be deported or denied reentry just because they've been accused of a crime, in this case, as you say, selling counterfeit shorts in New Jersey, without having been found guilty? And I read into this a little bit, and I saw that Justice Thomas wrote in his majority opinion that, quote, the government may regard a lawful permanent resident as seeking admission as soon as he committed a crime involving moral turpitude, even if the conviction occurred later, unquote, from Justice Thomas. So he really said it very explicitly right there, right? That expressly equates committing a crime with being accused of one if they don't have to wait for conviction to make that judgment, right?
Yes, Brian, and I thought that that was particularly rich coming from Justice Thomas, who has been accused of a thing or two in his history, right? Justice Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh are two justices that know a thing or two about mere accusations. And yet accusations have not stopped them in their career trajectory. Accusations have not stopped them from holding inscrutable, unaccountable lifetime power. And yet, for the little people, for everybody else, a mere accusation by this government apparently removes even basic due process before the government is allowed to act against you. So I absolutely think it has larger implications beyond the case of legal permanent residence of green card holders. But Brian, by the same token, we've already seen the lack of due process when it comes to people detained in these government immigrant detention centers or concentration centers, right? We've already seen the denial of due process, people rounded up on the suspicion of being an illegal immigrant, on the suspicion of being undocumented, on the suspicion of being out of status, and then denied their due process rights, and in some cases put on a plane before any lawyers have had a chance to plead their cases, right? So the lack of due process rights is usually not something that makes people riot in the streets, but it is kind of the definition of encroaching fascism, right? It is the point where the government can say, it's the Spanish Inquisition, right? It's the government can say something about you, and you have no reasonable opportunity to defend yourself.
Yeah,
that is America right now.
And my question about how broadly this applies is that this case was about letting a green card holder return to the country from outside. Does it now also apply to these cases you were just referring to, deporting any immigrants who are here who are merely accused of things who the government would like to remove?
I think it will. I don't know that yet. That's not the law of the land today. But do you want to be the green card holder who tries it, right? Because how does that situation that you just explained, Brian, become the law of the land? Well, it happens to somebody. Somebody says, hey, that's illegal. They appeal their case. It gets up to these same 6 Supreme Court justices, and they make the same ruling, a similar ruling to the one they made last week, right? Like that's how this thing that is illegal now becomes legal the first time the Trump administration tries it.
And I seem to remember Trump being accused of high crimes and misdemeanors on 2 occasions by the House of Representatives, but the Senate didn't convict him, so he couldn't be removed. I guess the same standard doesn't apply to those others. But listeners, who has a question, a comment, or a story for Elie Mystal, Justice Correspondent for The Nation, 212-433-WNYC, on any of the Supreme Court decisions from this term. We're going to move on now from Blanche versus Lau. Maybe even other legal issues. There are so many in play in the Trump era, or maybe even on big think questions for the nation's 250th birthday. 250 years and 3 days now, that I hope we'll have time to get into, including the social and economic rights that Elie writes are missing from the United States Constitution. 212-433, WNYC 212-433-9692. Call or text for Elie Mystal. Next case, National Republican Senatorial Committee versus Federal Election Commission. You call this the most important case about democracy since Citizens United. How come?
Did you all like Citizens United? Did you like the part where the Supreme Court said that money can corrupt politics? Well, this is Citizens United 2. The electric boogaloo, right? This is Citizens United off the chain. What it allows for is dark money, the kind of uncapped spending that people usually give to super PACs who then support various candidates. What this decision says is that those super PACs can now directly coordinate with the candidates of their choice, kind of eviscerating any real difference between light money and dark money, right? Like, because now you give your money to the super PAC, and you're not really giving it to the super PAC, you're giving it directly to the candidate of your choice. Now, that has always been true in some level. That's why we call it dark money. But the Supreme Court is kind of obliterating, for all intents and purposes, that distinction and allowing super PACs to directly coordinate with candidates. So if you're Peter Thiel, this is great. This is great, right? You've always had to keep your boy, your sock puppet, J.D. Vance, at like an arm's length to at least keep up the appearances of legality. Now you don't have to do that, right? Now you can just roll in with your billions of dollars and stick your hand up J.D. Vance's backside and tell him exactly what to say, which again has probably been happening for a while, but now it's legal.
Let me ask you to be you were very clear right now, but I was left after seeing the initial news coverage of that case, and I was off when it came down. So it's just based on what I read. But what Citizens United did 15 years ago was to allow independent groups who support or oppose certain candidates to spend unlimited amounts of money in those races. But they couldn't coordinate explicitly with the candidates. That's what you were just describing. And yes, when we've done candidate forums here in the primaries, we've heard candidates from left and right, to be fair, use that distinction to distance themselves from unpopular outside groups who spend money to support them, or just mysterious dark money outside groups who spend money to support them. Does this ruling mean the special interest groups could now coordinate with candidates to their heart's content, or is that wall still up to some degree?
There is no wall. That wall is down. That wall has been perforated. That wall has been cleared. There is no wall. Now, you might have, Brian, candidates on your program who still claim they're not coordinating with these dark money outside groups. So I don't know nothing about birthing no babies. Like, you still might have candidates who come on your show and say that. And they might not be lying, but they might be lying. And the point is that before they could argue they're not allowed to coordinate with those outside groups. Now they're allowed, and they'll just be asking you and your listeners to take their word for it that they're not.
Could there be a political silver lining here in a certain way? If an interest group is officially coordinating with a candidate now, unless they lie in the way you just described, can the candidate not wriggle out of being associated with them by saying, oh, I can't control what outside groups do?
Yeah, no, because not really, because they can still credibly say they can't control what outside groups, like if the outside group doesn't want to coordinate with the candidate, they can't force them to, if you will, right? So again, I think this gives even more wiggle room for candidates as opposed to boxing them in, right? Because the outside groups can coordinate with them, but they don't have to coordinate with the outside groups if they don't want to, or if they say they don't want to. And I think that the biggest issue is that there's no way to tell, right? There's no way to prove it. There's no transparency here. They don't have to say what they're doing or not at all. That's not part of the law. It's the law is focused on what the outside groups can and can't do, not on what the political candidates must do. And that's the biggest loophole here, right? It gives outside groups all of this power and influence, but no accountability for the candidates themselves. That's why our system is going to be even more corrupt going forward than it has been. And that's a ridiculous thing to say, given how corrupt it's been in the past, but it's only going to get worse now.
Before we move on to the next Supreme Court ruling that you wrote about, politically speaking, anger over big money in politics, I think it's fair to say, is one of the biggest driving forces behind the wave of DSA and other populist candidates who've been winning Democratic primaries this year. If Democrats come to control Congress and maybe the White House in coming years, could they do anything about this ruling or Citizens United itself? Or are these now out of political reach because the court ruled them protected by the Constitution?
Well, now we're getting into something that I think is that I really want to talk about. This, I think, should be the first test case for what's called, in the legal jargon, jurisdiction stripping. That is the idea that the Supreme Court does not have the constitutional authority to be the sole and final arbiter on what is or is not constitutional, right? The theory is that Congress can write a law, say that the law is constitutional, and prevent the Supreme Court from reviewing or potentially overturning that law. And I think, given the popular outrage at this rampant and rank corruption in our politics, if Democrats take back Congress and the House and the Senate, the first bill they should pass is a law overturning NRCC, overturning Citizens United, and saying in the law the Supreme Court's not allowed to review that. I think that should be our first test case. Now,
boy, that would be a huge change, right? Saying that the Supreme Court does not have the final say over constitutional questions.
Yes, it is. It is a nuclear option, if you will forgive a turn of phrase, right? But I think this is it. I think this is where we should start.
There are a few more of these under radar cases where you like the Supreme Court's decisions. And a listener is writing in about one of them. Listener writes, I clicked on the wrong text there. Let's see. Would Mr. Mystal please comment on Chattree versus United States regarding short-term surveillance of location data? So why don't you do that? You call this a massive win for anyone uncomfortable with the surveillance state. Tell us about Chattree versus United States.
Yeah, this was a good case. This is 7-2, good guys win for once, in my opinion, of the good guys. And to me, the good guys are people who want the Fourth Amendment to exist, right? And the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, right? But we always have a legal kind of debate and fight over what constitutes a search in the first place. In Chattree, this was a situation where the police were trying to solve a robbery. And to solve that robbery, they asked Google for location data within, I think it was 150 meters of the scene of the crime, right? So they wanted the location data from everybody's cell phones that entered into what's called a geofence of 150 meters around the scene of the crime within a certain period of time, right? They issued a warrant on Google. Google submitted to the warrant. They gave them the data, and based on that data, they were able to identify a potential criminal, and that person was eventually convicted largely on the strength of this geofence data. Well, the person who was convicted argued that that was an illegal search against him. Now, previous to this case, these searches were thought to be searches against Google, right? Google has the information. We're searching Google. But he's like, no, you're searching my cell phone. And that's how you got it without a warrant. You got it without my consent. You searched my data, and that should be actionable under the Fourth Amendment. And the court, 7-2, agreed. And that is huge because forcing the government, forcing the surveillance state to at least admit that they are searching you and not the big nameless, faceless, ISP providers or whatever. Like that is an important shift in the law. Whether or
So the
not the search is
uh-huh.
unreasonable is going to be still an open question. Like the case got remanded, so we'll have a new trial about whether or not, or a new motion about whether or not that search itself was unreasonable. But simply forcing the government to make a showing that the search was reasonable as to you, the cell phone user, as to Google, the cell phone provider, that is a huge change and a big win for privacy
Yeah,
advocates,
so
and I think for everybody.
your location data, if you have it turned on, is at least now we can say a topic that's covered under the Fourth Amendment. Here's a text with a question about the political donations case. Listener writes, isn't the really terrible impact of the Super PAC ruling that this dark money now has full access to the discounts on advertising afforded to campaigns? Have you thought about that?
I have not thought about that. Would they? That listener might be right. They might actually also have that ability. I mean, if they do, at least in that, to go back to your earlier hypothetical, Brian, at
Mm-hmm.
least then the candidate won't be able to say, "I have no idea what they're doing." Right? Like that would be a way to tie the candidate to the dark money, if the dark money is getting the same ad rates as the candidate's campaign, because they shouldn't be able to get those ad rates unless it is at the behest of the candidate, I believe. But no, I haven't fully thought through all of the implications of the advertising rates. I mean, look, we're talking about billionaires. I don't think that they particularly care about playing, an extra the 8%, but yeah, that's another aspect of it for sure.
Another ruling you like was in Watson versus Republican National Committee. This is generally known as the mail in ballots case. You call it probably the best decision that Justice Amy Coney Barrett has ever written. We did cover this one on the show and it came down. But tell us briefly what you think the court got right here.
Yeah, so the court got the idea of choice correct, right? It comes down to when does a voter choose their candidate, right? When does a voter choose who they want to be elected? The court said they make that choice when they fill out the ballot, not at some later date when the election officials receives the ballot. They make the choice when they fill out the ballot. And so if they fill out the ballot before election day, that choice should count regardless of when the post office gets off its pony and gets the ballot to the election official. And I think that is fundamentally right. I think that the four justices in dissent, it was a 5-4 decision, with Alito writing the principal dissent. And I think it's not surprising that Alito, who wrote Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, doesn't understand choice, doesn't understand when choices are made, and thinks that the government has to approve a choice before it's valid, right? That's very Alito to me. But Amy Coney Barrett, writing for a 5-4 majority, where she and John Roberts joined the three Democratic justices, she said no, the choice is made when the voter fills out the ballot, and the law allows for the states to receive that ballot at some later date after election day. The other important thing here, though, is that it is, and this is why I think you ultimately got at least two of the Republicans, is that this is really a case about states' rights. It's a case about whether or not Mississippi, in this case, has the right to determine when it receives its ballots, when a ballot is still valid, when it gets to the elections office, right? New York might have a different rule. California might have a different rule. North Dakota might have a different rule. It's about Mississippi allowing to conduct the election in the manner that makes sense for Mississippi. So if you don't like the Mississippi law, you can just change the Mississippi law. The mail-in ballots case does not mean that mail-in ballots have to be accepted. It just means that it's the states, not the federal government, that gets to make the determination on whether or not mail-in ballots are effective or accepted. And that could have an implication on the SAVE Act that Trump is desperate to pass, this federal regulation that would, force voter ID and get rid of mail-in ballots and all the kind of crazy election coup crap that Trump is into. Um, a ruling like the mail-in ballots case suggests that the SAVE Act might kind of be unconstitutional on arrival, according to 5 justices on the Supreme Court, because
Huh.
it overwhelms states' rights to control the time, place, and manner of their elections.
Interesting that you said Justice Barrett's ruling on this is good in your opinion because it supports the idea of choice. It's the first time I can remember anybody calling Amy Coney Barrett pro-choice. But
Right?
you definitely piqued a listener's interest with your suggestion that Congress pass a law kind of overturning Citizens United and using it as a test case to strip jurisdiction from overturning that law from the Supreme Court. Listener writes, regarding a test case to strip jurisdiction from the court, wouldn't the court simply rule that any law stripping its jurisdiction is unconstitutional? Despite the fact that the Constitution does not deny Congress that authority, wouldn't they simply make a ruling in their own favor? What do you say to that, listener?
And now we play our game, right? Which I like to call Civil War 3. This is the this is why jurisdiction stripping is a theory and not a reality. Because yes, I imagine that the minute you pass your law saying that the Supreme Court doesn't have the authority to review it, the Supreme Court says, "What? Yes, we do." And we overturn that law. And so then who wins? And then you are kind of in a situation where certain states would follow the laws as passed by Congress, and certain other states would follow the laws as passed by the Supreme Court. And then you have the beginnings of a conflict. The reason why I think campaign finance is a really good test case here is because it doesn't become this state government's going to do this and that state government is going to do that. It becomes this candidate is going to do this and that other candidate is going to do that.
Hmm.
And giving how much people abhor the open corruption in politics, it becomes a much more interesting political decision. I'm a candidate, I've got all this dark money, but my opponent is following the law, following this theoretical law passed by Congress that eliminates Citizens United, that eliminates dark money. Am I going to ignore that law? Well, maybe the public will take that out on me. Maybe the public will hold me to account for that. And so you put yourself in a situation again, I'm like, if it sounds like I am in 3D, 4D chess mode, like yes.
Yeah, you are in the
but
weeds.
right, but in 3D, 4D chess mode, it becomes an opportunity for jurisdiction stripping to be accepted by the public and for the people against jurisdiction stripping to be punished by the public in electoral politics in a different way than just about any other kind of law or issue you can think with jurisdiction stripping, right? Like if you do it with abortion rights, you're just in a situation where blue states allow abortion according to the law passed by Congress, and red states don't allow abortion according to the overruling of that law as by the Supreme Court. And we're basically in the same situation that we're already in, right?
Don't
But with
don't
campaign finance, I
mhm.
think it can be very different.
Don't we already have some jurisdiction stripping laws that have worked in Trump's favor? Or you tell me, maybe these are in another category. But haven't we seen the Supreme Court rule multiple times, like I think maybe on immigration cases, that, oh, we don't have the jurisdiction to even rule on this immigration policy of the Trump administration because the law that was passed governing it said it's not reviewable by the courts. Am I remembering that right?
I think you're more thinking about gerrymandering cases where the court has repeatedly said that political gerrymanders are non-justiciable, right? This is Rucho v. Common Cause, where Robert says that if you are gerrymandering your state for political advantage of one party or the other, the Supreme Court can't review that case. And so that is a similar thing to what I'm talking about. However, the difference, of course, is that this is one the Supreme Court says, I don't have the power to do this. Oh, well, good luck winning an election ever again, Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing we can do. Sorry, right?
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is not the Supreme Court ceding power. I'm talking about Congress taking power
Got it.
from the Supreme Court, and that's very different.
Now that we've gone to third degree and fourth degree chess, we're going to take a break and come back and maybe hit fifth degree and sixth degree chess with Elie Mystal, Justice Correspondent for The Nation. We'll get a little bit into the transgender rights ruling, which he said goes much further than on sports, which is the only way that you may have heard of it before, and a very high concept thing that he wrote that I keyed on in one of his other articles about what's missing from the United States Constitution on this 250th birthday week of the country that he thinks might be put in there. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue for another few minutes with Elie Mystal, Justice Correspondent for The Nation, who has written a lot about the Supreme Court decisions that came down in the last few weeks and really the last few months, including one that we've been going through some of the particulars of that were on 7 decisions that he said didn't get the headline treatment that maybe birthright citizenship and some others did, but that he thought were worth revisiting. I do want to get your take on the transgender rights ruling, which you wrote about in a different article. This is the one that allowed Idaho and West Virginia to ban trans women from competing in women's sports. Most of our listeners have probably heard about that ruling, at least the basics. But your article on that said the ruling goes way beyond sports. How so?
There are 2 parts to the ruling, right? One is the Title IX claim. Title IX protects people from gender discrimination. The court ruled 9-0 that these trans women athletes had no right under Title IX. And that does not stop at the athletic field. Title IX protects against gender discrimination everywhere, in the workplace, in the public sphere. And the Supreme Court saying that they have no rights under Title IX means that that will be translated into the workplace and the public sphere. I think the court is completely wrong about the Title IX analysis because they were saying that it's not sex discrimination. But it is, in my view, gender phenotype discrimination, which is already illegal under Title IX. The gender expression discrimination is you girl cannot be on the cheerleading team because you're not blonde and cheerleaders are blonde. The court has already ruled that that is discrimination under Title IX. I think this is the exact same thing. You, trans girl, cannot be on the team because you don't look like we want you to look, is essentially what they're arguing. And if you can do that on the athletic field, you can do that in the workplace. But the bigger issue is the 6-3 part of the ruling, which said that transgender athletes have no rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Folks, I have reluctantly come to understand that advocating and defending trans rights is controversial for some people. I don't know why, but I understand that it is. The idea, if you think that you can take away somebody's equal protection rights, the literal right to argue under the 14th Amendment that they have the same rights as everybody else, and think that that just applies to volleyball, you're insane. That is not how this is going to work. And we have seen the blueprint for how they're going to do it with the affirmative action decision. If you remember, the decision overturning affirmative action technically was just about affirmative action and college admissions. But we've seen the Trump administration use that decision in, this is a point that was made to me by NYU law professor Melissa Murray. We've seen how the Trump administration has used the affirmative action decision in DEI hiring programs across the federal government to cut off funding from NGOs and other institutions who they allege practice DEI in some way that they can't even define. We've seen that decision metastasize across governments and across state governments. That's the same thing that's going to happen with this trans decision. So it's gonna start with girls volleyball, but it's going to end up in whether or not trans people have a right to exist in the workplace alongside everybody else. It is a disgusting decision and a gross revocation of basic constitutional rights for everybody, and it must be fought.
There would be a very different kind of argument, though, right? Because a lot of people support a ban on trans women in women's sports because they think there's a biological unfair advantage there. And I know that can be debated, but in some cases that is the case. You can't say that when somebody's applying to be a lawyer or a nurse or something like that. So how could it be generalized in the way that you just predicted?
Yeah, see, this is the thing though. People support, they want a carve out. People think that you can take away rights from people in one area, but not take away rights from people more generally. And that is not how our laws work. And again, we've seen that not only with the affirmative action cases, but we've seen it with lots of LGBTQ plus cases in the past, where once you have the wedge, once you get your foot in the door of taking away somebody's rights, that those wedge issues then cascade against that group of people across a number of factors. So sure, go on to court and say, well, I don't think they should be allowed on the field, but surely they should be allowed in the workplace. And good luck making that argument to the kinds of bigots who are willing to make this argument in the first place. That's your problem, and that's always the problem. And again, I am not speaking extemporaneously. I am not speaking theoretically. I am just telling people how it has worked in the past. What we've seen when this is done to any group of people, we see it never stays on the issue that got the initial victory. We always see it metastasize and grow and spread like a rights-eating cancer across numerous fields and industries. And the same thing is going to happen to transgender people here. It starts on the athletic field, but it's very soon. You're not going to be able to go to the bathroom. You're not going to be able to participate. You're not going to be able to apply to be a nurse. It's gonna infect our society, which is how racism works, which is how bigotry works, which is how sexism works. It infects things. It infects what you think you hold dear. It will take that away from you too. So while it seems to some people an easy case, so, well, we're just going to take away some of their rights in this one area, it never stays there.
One thing that I think a lot of people may misunderstand about the sports ruling itself, and I heard a right-wing sports talk host on the day the ruling came down cheering, "Yay, that's it! No more men competing against women." But it's not that clear. Correct me if I'm wrong, because it allows states to make their own determination. So this was about Idaho and West Virginia, which wanted to ban people born men from participating in women's sports, but around 20 states do not currently ban all trans girls and women from female sports teams. Different states and also different leagues have different standards. Like the LPGA allows in pro golfers in what they call ladies professional golf who are trans if they had gotten treatment early enough that they never went through male puberty. So states and leagues can still set those rules as they see fit. The Supreme Court did not bar them from doing that. Do I have at least that much right?
Yes, Brian, but clip that and then bring me back on in 2028 or 2029, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how you are now made wrong by the future, right? Because, yes, this case was about whether or not discrimination against trans people was allowed, right? Can you discriminate against trans people in West Virginia, in Idaho, what have you? The next case is going to be about whether or not discrimination against trans women is required, right? So a blue state that allows trans people to participate. The next thing is going to be the government, the Trump administration, forcing those blue states, again, saying to those blue states, you can't allow that kind of diversity. And they will sue, and the court will be ruling on whether or not blue states are forced to discriminate against trans women. And that's going to be the fight we're going to have next. And guess what? You're going to lose it. So again, when I say this doesn't stay on the athletic field, I should also say this doesn't stay in West Virginia. This happens now in California. This happens now in New York, because that's going to be the next fight, whether or not discrimination is not merely allowed, but required. And that's what's coming next.
We're almost at
And I keep saying the one other thing I want to say is that I keep talking about trans women because that's who the discrimination is happening against. You'll note that this isn't happening to trans men. Trans men are allowed to compete and be wherever they want, but it's only trans women that are facing this kind of discrimination, which again, to me, shows that it is a point and click equal protection violation because trans women are not equally protected as trans men, even to say nothing of cis women and cis men.
right.
But
And the other side,
nobody seems to care about that.
Go around with you and say, well, there isn't the same statistical, on average, biological advantage in that direction, but we'll let that argument play out.
I really get sick of that argument because, look, I was at varsity football practice when I was a 14-year-old kid, right? And I got lit up. I got snot bubbles out of my nose from a 19-year-old kid who had been held back a year. Could I say, hey, ref, check that man's hormones? No, it's sports. It hurt. I got up and I competed again. And I think it is fundamentally sexist and patriarchal to argue that a girl can't take a hit. They can. That's part of a contact sport. But that's a different issue, I suppose.
We're almost out of time with Elie Mystal, Justice Correspondent for The Nation. You wrote a big think article for The Nation's, America's 250th birthday that I definitely wanted to get your take on because I think it's so interesting and it has such big implications if anybody were to act on it regarding racial inequality under the law and a high concept takeaway of yours that the core failure of our Constitution is that it's based on individual political and civil rights with no mention of economic or social rights. Can you unpack that distinction?
When you look at modern constitutions, that's constitutions that are written after ours. What you see is not just this kind of capitalist government, get out of my back, get out of my pocket, let me be who I can. What you see with modern constitutions is the inclusion of both social and economic rights, right? Rights to dignity, rights to habitability, rights to the environment, like all of these kind of soft rights that we need to live are actually put into modern constitutions in a way that our ancient, antiquated constitution did not contemplate, right? And that is its core failure. The way that I put it in my piece is that our constitution is all about negative rights, right? It's about what the government can't do, right? They can't do this, they can't do that, they can't take away this, they can't prohibit that. Our Constitution does not have positive rights, what the government must do, right? The easiest way to think about this is the right to vote, right? We have a bunch of stuff in our Constitution saying that the government cannot deny the right to vote on account of race, gender, what have you, right? We don't have a right that says you have a right to vote. That's actually not in the Constitution. We don't have a positive right to vote. And we don't have anything in the Constitution saying, and the government must make sure that everybody has a right to vote. There's no, and that's why the government can diminish the right to vote, dilute the right to vote, make it more difficult for people to vote. You should have a Constitution that says, no, you have a positive right to vote, and the onus is upon the government to make sure that right happens, right? And if you can think about that in terms of the right to vote, hopefully you can think about that in terms of across of a number of areas. You have a right to health care, potentially, right? You have a right to habitability of your environment. You have a right to a living wage. You have a right to dignity. You have a right to equality, right? So if you think about positive rights.
So Congress can pass such laws to that effect, but it's not guaranteed. They're not guaranteed in the Constitution, is your point.
All the government has to do is not affirmatively take those rights away. They don't have to do anything to make sure that those rights are accessible. And it's one of our core failures.
Elie Mystal, The Nation's Justice Correspondent and a columnist there. He is also an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center. He's the author of 2 books, the New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, and Bad Law, 10 Popular Laws That Are Ruining America. Elie, thanks very much for today.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the decline of reading in American life. and what it might mean. The cover story of the August edition of The Atlantic makes the case that America has entered what the writer calls a post-literate age. A post-literate age. It's from staff writer Rose Horowitch. A librarian in Texas told Horowitch about a 3-year-old who cried on her first day of school for her tablet. A professor at Harvard told her about a student who used ChatGPT to translate A Clockwork Orange into simpler English because the original novel was tough to get through. Horowitz has been collecting stories like these, and she thinks they're evidence of a real shift in how Americans relate to reading and therefore to the world. Her piece in The Atlantic is titled, "The End of Reading is Here." Rose, thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming on the show about it. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And listeners, you can help us report this story. Do you yourself read less than you used to? Are you a teacher, librarian, student, or parent seeing the shift up close among others? What do you want to say? What do you want to ask? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. For the majority of the listeners who have not read your article, you begin and end it with the Library of Alexandria. Why was that the right place to bookend a piece about reading habits in 2026 America?
Yes, I started a very long time ago with the Library of Alexandria, and I started with the story of the Library of Alexandria because for a long time, historians thought that the library, disappeared because of an act of war or violence. People thought that Julius Caesar burned it. But lately, the kind of scholarly consensus has been that actually the library just was neglected until it eventually disappeared. And so it wasn't that, this very dramatic action, led to the start of the Dark Ages. It was actually that, the fact that the library was allowed to be destroyed, that nobody cared about maintaining it, meant that the Dark Ages were already there. And I wanted to kind of draw a parallel with, today, what we see, the decline of reading, kind of the decline of the importance of reading, that maybe we're going through something similar.
Let's define the decline of reading. You have some data, I think, on how much less the average American is reading compared to the past. But you also write that paradoxically, and I know people will call in text with this, and, they won't be wrong, Americans are probably reading more words than ever before because of all the social media and texting and everything else. So what's the data that you're working from to, write an end of literacy article?
Yes, exactly. So the data shows that, the share of Americans who read a book or an article on any given day has declined by 40% over the past 2 decades. In 2022, which is the most recent year that we have really strong data for, fewer than half of all Americans read a book at all, and only 38% read a novel or short story. And so, the data is kind of very clear, all going in this direction. But you're right to point out that, I note in the piece that, people often talk about this as a literacy crisis, and I don't think that's right. People are actually probably reading more than ever. We read so many emails, so many text messages, so many social media posts. But what I think is happening is that is actually crowding out kind of the time necessary to read, to really get engaged in a serious work of literature. And it's making it hard to focus on anything for an extended period of time. So we're almost reading so many words that, we can't really pay attention to any of them.
And so to the place of schools in all of this, you write, faced with shrinking attention spans and declining comprehension, schools might have been expected to resist the impulse towards shorter passages and shallower reading, your words. And yet, what actually happened?
Yes, so we have a lot of data that, teachers are assigning fewer and fewer books. A survey from last year found that, most teachers assigned between 0 and 4 books a year, which is a decline from the past. And so, we're seeing kind of an emphasis on excerpts, on reading comprehension questions to prepare students for standardized testing. And so that's kind of, one end of the coin, one side of the coin is that, books have really left the classroom. And then on the other side, we're seeing that, schools are really bringing in tablets and Chromebooks and iPads. A survey found that 80% of elementary school teachers said that students received a school-issued device by kindergarten. So, we're seeing a lot fewer books in schools, and then, that's been replaced with, digital devices.
So on why this matters, I'm going to read another quote from your article. And listeners, this is the one to really pay attention to if you haven't been paying attention yet. Rose wrote in The Atlantic, "The decline of reading will bring about changes of the same magnitude as the advent of reading and writing. It will affect our innermost thoughts, our society's politics and culture, and how we tell the history of our civilization. If we look closely, we can see that these changes have already begun." Wow. How do you know?
So, as part of this piece, I really looked at the history of the rise of reading. It seems like people have been reading forever, but actually reading is kind of unnatural for humans, and it only emerged 6,000 years ago, which is actually relatively recent, in the course of human history. And, what we see in this great book by Walter Ong, who wrote Orality and Literacy, is that the advent of reading and writing completely transformed society. Writing separates the writer from what they've written, so it allows for the more dispassionate spread of information. You have to slow down to write something. We write a lot slower than we speak, and also you can see it reflected back at you on the page and then go back to it and kind of gain new understanding. And Ong argues that this ushered in a new form of rational and analytical thought, and that it really was allowed for, philosophy and modern science and all of these things that we kind of take for granted now, actually really depended on reading and writing. And so, I was looking, if we see that happened, when writing first came into being, what happens now as we're reading and writing so much less and sort of replacing that with video?
Some interesting pushback texts coming in. Listener writes, "Former New Yorker, mom, lawyer, recovering classical musician in North Jersey here. Longtime listener, my kids are obsessed with books and reading. We go to our local library at least weekly." That's one. Here's another one. "Barnes & Noble has flourished recently. My daughter-in-law just asked me for a book for her birthday. I don't see a decline in reading." So I can tell you just from the standpoint of this show, for what it's worth, small, unrepresentative sample, we're getting pitched by publishers every day for the spate of new books that they're always releasing.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point. I write in my piece, print book sales were higher last year than they were a decade ago. You see all these celebrity book clubs. Substack is flourishing. Barnes & Noble is opening new stores. And so there are all these kind of optimistic, anecdotes that people are reading more. At the same time, what the data shows is that it's the small group of readers that are reading more. So the pool of people who read books is continually shrinking. Last year, 20% of Americans read 80% of all the books that were read. And so what we see is kind of as fewer and fewer people read, the people who still do kind of lean into that identity more. They actually seem to spend more time reading than they used to, but they're just becoming more and more of a minority in society.
Is it necessarily bad? I could imagine an argument that says, look, society has always revolved around whatever the communication technology of the time is. So there were people who worried about a negative effect that reading would have when the printing press was first invented. Oh, people are going to sit around and get lost in their books, and they're not going to interact with each other so much anymore, and we're going to have this isolated society and people not acting in community. You've probably heard that historical critique. And then if you go to the 20th century, why did people start going to movies and movie theaters? Because there wasn't the technology to have anything like that in your home. And why did they start listening to the radio? Because that was the first time that live streaming, if we want to use that word, audio was available to people in their homes. Then eventually came television and what that changed. And, and now all these things coexist, but they're all sort of competing with each other for people's attention. But society didn't disintegrate because of the book. Society didn't disintegrate because of radio. Society moved on. I mean, certainly, Hitler used radio very effectively, right? But so did FDR. And society adapts to the technology that's there, and it's always complicated. What would you say to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I tried to, in the piece, when in the process of writing it, I, came across a lot of, these examples that you're citing. The Atlantic had published a piece 126 years ago that was really worried about what the daily newspaper was going to do to people's brains. And, reading the news was going to stop people from reading books. And so, it really is a perennial complaint that, new technologies will destroy everything. I think one thing that's illustrative here is Plato's story, The Phaedrus, where there's this kind of famous example of Socrates worrying that writing will ruin people's memories because they'll never have to exercise their memory and they'll just write everything down. And I think if you look at that, in one sense he was right. We don't practice using our memories anymore, as much anymore, and so it would be very hard to memorize the Iliad or the Odyssey today. And yet, I think a lot of people would say that trade-off is worth it. So I tried to be open to the possibility that there's, something that we don't yet know that will, come from this that makes video better than reading. But at the same time, I think I lay out in the piece that, there are a lot of ways that reading has just structured the society that we live in, that we, need to be cognizant of, that is changing.
So does society become, since we talk a lot about politics on the show, radicalized? Does it become more politically uninformed? What happens culturally with the decline of reading that you're describing?
Mm-hmm. So from sort of reading, sifting through studies and talking to experts, it seems that the effects on politics are that, video kind of privileges a politician who is really charismatic, kind of appears authentic and of the people, is able to present things as, very simplistic. Every policy problem has a very simple solution, and is able to kind of make people feel things, grab their attention, and make them want to watch a video. And, in a sense that is now a very good way to campaign, is just to, be a very charismatic person, because everyone's going to see the way that you're, kind of acting and speaking all the time. The challenge arises when, if everything has to be communicated in a 15-second soundbite, what has to be glossed over in order to do that? And, a lot of things just aren't that simple. So I think that, that's sort of what we see politically.
Here's a text from a listener. I'm a middle school teacher in East New York, Brooklyn, and I noticed that now that kids can't have their phones in school, they have started to get back into reading, but it's still very difficult to get them to complete reading homework when they presumably have access to devices, etc., at home. So that's one interesting one. Here's another teacher calling in. Rebecca in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Brian. I want to speak not to leisure reading, but rather to what the person who just texted spoke to. I teach high school at an independent school, and I want to speak to the connection between reading and writing and analytical thinking. And one thing that is militating against our ability to get students to read longer form scholarly pieces is that a lot of databases that our kids use for research projects, for instance, I'm thinking of something called JSTOR, now offer AI assistance where it will distill the entire article and tell you what it's speaking to, what other scholars it's discussing, and then suddenly kids don't have to read a 30-page piece. Or they're trying to read a book, but because so much is open source and online, they can just type in, summarize this book for me. So when students, because their attention spans are shorter, or because they're distracted by shiny things, Instagram or TikTok, they are not sitting down to read. And I think they're also very much losing the ability to read. And if they can't read in longer form pieces, they can't analyze or think critically for themselves, which means they can't write in an analytical or critical way. So these things are so closely connected. And my colleagues and I are definitely seeing that kids can't hold their attention, and they also can't process, and they can't digest. So we're trying to go back to analog things and now say, okay, we're not using an online textbook anymore because we know what you guys can do with it. You're going to have to buy the hard version, and we are going to do reading checks every day, and we're going to teach you how to annotate in the margins to try to push against this. But I will say that as teachers, it's like the whole world and all these tech companies are trying actively to undermine what we're doing. And I will say that we're seeing kids' intellectual abilities are weakening year by year. And as a parent as well, this is so depressing.
Yeah. Rose Horowitch, I want to put you on the spot and see if, as the writer of The Atlantic, of this piece on The Atlantic, you want to engage with this teacher, Rebecca from Manhattan, because I'm listening to her and I'm thinking, wow, this is just the kind of person who Rose might have quoted in the article if you had spoken to her, or who might pique your interest.
Yes. Hi, Rebecca. It's so great to hear from you and hear your experience. And that was something that I was hearing from other teachers that I spoke with as well. We know that scores on the ACT, reading and sections have declined for the past 7 years, and they are now at their lowest level in 30 years. And, I was just hearing over and over from teachers that they've always kind of had to focus on teaching students about the content of, what they're reading, but that now they actually have to teach them how they expect them to read and kind of how to recognize what is a metaphor, how to, persist through more challenging or works of text. And so there's that real shift that they have to teach them, like how they expect them now to read books.
Rebecca, anything you want to say as a follow-up before you go?
Yeah, thank you. I would say as a history teacher rather than an English teacher, what's less important to me than identifying a metaphor is actually asking kids, do you see the connection between what we just spoke about and the idea that you read about what was occurring in the 1640s? Do you know what I mean? It's actually asking them to connect ideas. And because they're not reading as deeply as they used to, they're not making those connections. So it's really the deeper underlying analytical and critical thinking muscle that I think is atrophying.
Thank you for your call, Rebecca. We really appreciate it, and good luck doing that. I guess grunt work, should we call it that? Educational grunt work. The grind of, and it's really interesting, Rose, right? As an antidote to this, day by day, reinforcing with the kids, you have to have done this particular block of reading when you come in the next day and you're going to be held accountable for it. I don't know how easy it is to use that as a model and get teachers all over the country to do that every single day.
Yes, so for that, I didn't report as much on that for this piece, but it's something that I've definitely reported on in the past, and it is just, very hard. I mean, as we were hearing from the other person who texted in, it's really hard to make sure that kids are reading outside of school and doing their homework, when there's a lot of temptations and distractions.
And interestingly, we're getting so many texts that note that kids are not being assigned full books in school, including at what might be called popular or elite New York City schools that people are mentioning and calling them by that name, those names. So yeah, this is, and there was another article that I read in another magazine just the other day about the elite universities in general. I mean, Ivies and universities like that not assigning full books to their students in the way they used to. You concur with that?
Yes. So in 2024, I wrote a piece that was called "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books." And it was, about this topic exactly. It was, professors finding that their students were arriving at college and their middle and high schools had never asked them to read a full book or had only asked them to read a few full books. And so they were just utterly unprepared for the reading load. So I think that is a really interesting kind of contributor to this that sometimes gets overlooked, with the focus on technology and cell phones, that, what's happening in schools is also a big driver.
Yeah, and that article was interesting because it was in the Conservative National Review, and the conservative writer's angle was, oh, you think liberal bias is a problem at elite universities? Look at this. They're not even being given full books or long articles to read as opposed to excerpts and chapters and stuff. Cordelia in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hello, Cordelia.
Hi, Brian. Nice to speak to you. I'm a student from New York. I recently graduated high school.
Congratulations.
And I just wanted to talk, thank you, about my experience in the classroom. I've found that we do not read very much. In the past 2 years, in each year, we've read one book in English class and none in any other class. And I just find that the culture of reading has really changed. And I believe that it is on part because of the technology access that students have had, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, a lot of my teachers have confessed to me that they don't read either. Even my English teacher. And I really think that we cannot be teaching only nonfiction like a lot of schools have started doing. And instead, the fiction writing helps students understand and interpret big ideas and kind of what your caller was talking about with critical thinking skills. And I've tried to push to read in my own life, but I know that a lot of my friends and fellow classmates have not. And yeah.
Yeah. Cordelia, Rose, anything you want to ask Cordelia as a recent high school grad?
I guess I'm curious, and I know you've been progressing through the years, but, how things have kind of changed over time, from even when you started in 9th grade to now 12th or graduating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the quantity of books has surely decreased. There's also definitely more of an emphasis on using computers in class. And what you said earlier about using multiple choice questions and studying for things like the Regents exams in New York has become far more popular than especially reading fiction stories that require more like critical thought and abstract thought. And the book choices also have been shorter books with a lot more concrete language. And I know that my fellow classmates and occasionally I struggle to comprehend it despite our efforts. And I think that comes not only from the students, but also just from the culture in schools.
Cordelia, thanks. Call us again. And congratulations again on graduating. That term concrete language, that's a thing, right?
Yes. Well, one thing that we know that really struck me as I was listening to Cordelia is that the more you read, the easier it is to comprehend because you just have so much more background knowledge. So it is really a compounding problem if we're not, if we're not exposing people to as many ideas or as much information, it becomes, or as much vocabulary, it becomes then much harder to confront each new book.
I have a friend who wrote a novel recently and got it published and told me that some of the reviews on social media sites were that the book was too literary and there wasn't enough action. And so there's that, what I think the caller was calling concrete, as opposed to sort of literary or abstract thinking that's being conveyed in reading. Before we run out of time, obviously the overwhelming majority of our listeners are convinced that this is a real problem and really threatens society in various ways. If, given the politics of our area generally, this line from your article will put the rest of them over the top. Trump's communication style is perfectly suited to an oral society. So if you want to talk about that, if it's not obvious, you can do that for a minute and then connect it also in a political context to inequality, because I would imagine some people lose out more than others in a post-literate age. So give us some thoughts on those two things, and then we're out of time.
Okay. Yes. So in the piece, I say that Trump is our first post-literate president. And what I mean by that is that it's very difficult to imagine him being elected, in a country where information is primarily spread through text. But he's, so good at kind of communicating in this age through videos and social media posts. He kind of uses epithets that honestly call back to Homer of saying, Sleepy Joe, and it's just easy to remember and repeat. He really appeals to, his listeners' emotions. And so, all of these things we kind of see that he has been able to kind of exploit the changes of the post-literate age, and other politicians are starting to try to recognize and mimic this. And to what you were saying about inequality, we definitely do find that though declines are happening, for everyone in the amount that they're reading, it's clearly separated as well by, socioeconomic status. And so, that is a real threat if, some people continue reading and then some people don't have that access or aren't asked to do it in school. That is a big challenge we face.
The article is called "The End of Reading is Here." And Rosa, I want to say that as I was reading the article yesterday and just kind of looking at your article block, if we had another half hour, I would start pushing you down the road of how 3 different universities issued reports on why higher education and elite institutions generally are losing public support. But maybe we can do that another time. For today, The End of Reading is Here. Rose Horowitch, staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
ABC is fighting back against a barrage of attacks from the FCC.
The View has covered the issues you care about for nearly 30 years. Now, the FCC wants to control who is allowed to appear on the show. Viewers, use your voice.
I spoke to the lawyer driving the crusade to crush the liberal media. Turns out we had a difference of opinion on this week's On the Media from WNYC. Find On the Media wherever you get your podcasts.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Now it's time for July's episode of Wild NYC, our once-a-month, year-long exploration of our connection to the natural world. Yes, even city dwellers need to pay attention to the other species we share this space with. Today we're talking about insects, the moths, butterflies, ants, bees, beetles, other things underfoot, overhead, and all around if you look, and why their survival is human survival. This will be less about roaches and lanternflies, which get a lot of attention, though they are in the group. Urban botanist and ecologist Marielle Anzalone is here, as she is each month in the series, and today she's joined by Jessica Ware, entomologist and division chair of invertebrate zoology at the American Museum of Natural History and co-founder of Entomologists of Color. She happens to have a particular interest in dragonflies, I'm told, so we'll give them some attention. Welcome back, Marielle and Jessica.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
Marielle, I said not so much on cockroaches and lanternflies, but do we need to say something about them first in the context of, I'm introducing a series on insects or a segment on insects like it's a good thing, but most people think, ooh, insects.
Oh, insects are amazing. One way to think about insects is that when people talk about wildlife in the city, they tend to think of vertebrates like squirrels and birds. But insects are wildlife too. And the ones you called out are not native to New York City, but we have so many different kinds of super cool insects that are native to New York in that they've lived in New York City for thousands of years and have evolved with the plants that live here too. And they're really critical. They do lots of things that we as humans overlook, but they're a really important part of our local nature.
And I wonder if you each have a favorite insect to shout out. Are dragonflies yours, as I think I read, Jessica?
Hands down. Dragonflies are pretty cool. They're an order of insects called Odonata, dragonflies and damselflies. They're the earliest things to fly, the earliest branching, branch in the tree of life of insects that have wings. They're top predators. They're colorful. What's not to love?
And Marielle?
It's like asking me to choose a favorite child or something. There's so many. But I'll call out that New York City has its own bee species. It's called the Gotham sweat bee, and it was first noted in Brooklyn in 2009. So that's pretty cool.
What is a Gotham? Did you even know about that, Jessica? Sounds like maybe you didn't.
Oh, no, they did. There's also, I was just going to say, the Hymenoptera, that is a good, so the bees, ants, and wasps are good. And there's also the Manhattan ant. The Manhattan. Yes. I have a hard time saying that all is one word. There are some cool ones that are just here in our little hamlet, in our sleepy hamlet.
What's the name of that bee again, Marielle, and what does it look like?
It's called the Gotham sweat bee. So the genus is Lasioglossum, and then the specific epithet is Gotham, which is was actually, I think, described by one of Jessica's colleagues at the museum, John Asher. And it was noted in Brooklyn. It's a really tiny kind of sweat bee. So these are one of the really interesting solitary bees. I think most people think of bees, they think of honeybees, which of course are not native. They're really domesticated animals, kind of like cows, right? That were brought here by colonists. But we have a lot of super cool native bees that tend to be solitary, and they make their nests either in the ground or in cavities. So this would be one of those kinds of bees, and they only eat pollen from very specific kinds of plants. And they're pretty small, and they're very cute. Worth looking for. They come out in the spring.
Jessica, what?
I said they're kind of colorful, right? They're pretty.
Yeah, some of them definitely are.
Listeners, we can take a few phone calls about insects today, and I'm going to throw a bonus topic out there in a second. You'll hear why. But listeners, do you have a favorite insect? Shout out your favorite if you do, and why it's your favorite. Or maybe you have a question about insects and their role in the ecosystem, which we'll get a little more into. Has anyone watched the leafcutter ants at work in that very cool display in the new wing of the Museum of Natural History? And want to talk about what that experience was like? Call or text 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692 with your favorite insect or your questions about insects. And here's the bonus question, because Marielle, last month when the topic was wildflowers, I'm actually going to admit to you and the listeners that I regretted afterwards that we spent so much time on the environmental threats to wildflowers in our area that I didn't leave enough time for you to simply glory in their magnificence and say what your favorite New York area wildflowers are. So listeners, you're invited on your favorite insects or your favorite wildflowers today. And then I'm going to feel better about closing that loop. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. But Jessica, tell us more about what we rely on insects for, like their place in the ecosystem, and tie that to the scary part, which is the decline in insect populations that the world is experiencing.
So insects have been around for a really long time. Flying insects have been around for around 400 million years. So if we think about flowering plants like the wildflowers you just talked about, they evolved a couple 100 million years after insects. We as humans, our earliest hominin ancestors, were a tiny blip in this timeline. Almost all life that you think about actually evolved with insects predating them. So everything is kind of really interrelated in the ecosystems. We rely on insects for pollination. That's a really important job that they do, but that's kind of the one that's the most commonly known. They're also really important food sources. So a lot of migratory birds, reptiles, fish, you name it, as well as other insects, rely on insects for food. And insects are important as regulators. So the reason why we don't have as many, flies or mosquitoes or things flying around is because of things like dragonflies that actually control the population of some of the species. The reason why we don't trip over every tree that's ever fallen or every dead dog that we've ever buried is because of insects, because they're decomposers. So they decompose, they aerate the soil, which allows us to grow the crops that we rely on, to feed the human planet. And then they're also important as filterers in freshwater systems. So there's a lot of hidden jobs that probably, Brian, many things that happened in your day before you got to our conversation were probably already impacted by something that an insect did. Because it's so invisible, people don't realize how vital they are. Insects are declining. We know this. They're declining at a rate that we've never seen before. There have been other mass extinctions that have happened. There's a famous one that killed the dinosaurs, and there have been other ones that really have negatively impacted insects. We think that this extinction period that we're entering in, which is caused by humans, that we think this is actually something that we should all be pretty scared about. We should all be working together to try and mitigate. If insects decline at the rate that we think that they are declining right now, we have data from around the world, different types of insects, different types of data. If this continues, it actually threatens the survival of mammals, of fish, of reptiles, of plants, and of course, of humans.
Let's hear some of our listeners' favorites. One listener writes in a question form, "No love for ladybugs?" And another one writes, "Lightning bugs, are they only on the East Coast?" Another one, "I love seeing the first fireflies of summer." You'll tell me if that's the same as lightning bugs. Another one writes, "I love spiders. They create beautiful and functional art and eat the insects I don't love." And then we have Hank in Monmouth County. You're on WNYC. Hi, Hank.
Hey, everybody. So my thought is about the praying mantis, and I've had multiple ones at my home last year, and one hung out for quite some time on my back porch on my rocking chair, and I noticed when I went out it was still there. I thought it was a stick, and because everything was gone, the head was gone and everything, but apparently it was called molting, and it was very interesting.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jessica, so many insects that our listeners have put on the table just there.
I love those all, and how cool that you got to see a praying mantis molting. So insects, they do that. They shed their skin to a larger and larger size until their adulthood in the order Mantodea, which are the mantids. So that's cool you got to observe that. Lightning bugs and fireflies, two different words, but they mean the same thing. They're the same type of insect, and they're an insect that there's multiple species. They do exist in the East Coast, but you can get them in Utah, for example. So if you consider that to be West Coast, then yes, they're also in the West Coast. And they're kind of cool because they have an enzymatic reaction that happens in their body that allows them to flash a bright light that can either be kind of bluish in color, reddish in color, or greenish, yellowish in color. And they do that so they can communicate with each other. So those flashes that remind us of summer, those are actually males and females looking for a mate, looking for love.
Here is Jake calling in from Morris County, a fellow insect biologist, Jessica. And I think this is a call I never imagined we would get, a caller with a favorite kind of mosquito. Jake, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. First time caller, long time listener. I'm an insect biologist out in Morris County, New Jersey, and I specifically deal with mosquitoes and West Nile virus. I really wanted to call in and talk about Toxorynchites rutilis. It's a type of mosquito that doesn't ever prey on humans. The males and the females, actually, they're so large. They're the largest mosquitoes in New Jersey. They have this beautiful bluish coloration, blue and gold. And they're both nectar feeders, so they never actually bite anything. They don't have mouth parts that can bite anything. So really, we almost never see them over here. They're super rare, but they're super beautiful, cool to look at.
That is super cool. Well, you're going to have to talk to our listener, Lacey in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, who texted, shout out to any insect that eats mosquitoes, my mortal enemies.
So funnily enough,
yes.
The larvae of Toxorynchites rutilis are predatory on other mosquito larvae.
Oh, interesting.
Jake, thank
More
you
the reason
very
to
much.
love it.
Jessica, you know that guy?
No, Jake, I don't think I know you, but love to meet another fellow New Jerseyan who also loves insects.
And to the question that I put on the table before, after reading a couple of the texts, Marielle, are fireflies and lightning bugs the same thing?
Oh, yeah, they are the same thing. Jessica touched on that a little bit. I think it's regional differences in what people call them, but they're both the same name for kind of a group of bioluminescent beetles. Yeah, and they're a huge like sign of summer for our neck of the woods. Yeah, but you know, the thing that's interesting about them too is like people love them, right? You obviously have a lot of people talking about them. But those kinds of insects, they're beetles, they're not just here like by magic. They're here because there's habitat that's here that allows them to survive and have survived in our area for thousands of years. So if we don't start thinking about ways in which we can continue to create healthy habitats for these animals, you know, they're like biological indicators. As we, you know, lose habitat or degrade habitat, we lose these other species that we share our city with. And we also lose these beautiful different signs of summer that we delighted in as children. And of course, we want the next generation to be able to do the same thing. So as much as we love them, I think it's important to also think about what their needs are, and are we meeting them?
So go ahead, Jessica, real quick.
I was just to reiterate, I mean, Marielle's right. Last year, we actually had a very wet spring. So we ended up, the larvae need to have moist soil, and we had a lot of fireflies, and people were so excited. But that disconnect of like the fact that you know, it's because of the habitat. That's why the habitat was good. That's why they survived and had a big burst last summer.
So in our last 2 minutes, here's the bonus round. Listener writes, I love fleabane as this listener's favorite wildflower. This is the bonus wildflower round. So resilient and just cute. And Evelyn in the Rockaways with a favorite wildflower. Right, Evelyn?
Oh, hi, yes. Yes, I love the milkweed. I let it grow in my garden. I don't pull it up, and it brings the monarchs in.
Thank you very much. And Marielle, now you get yours left over from last month. Do you have a favorite or a few favorite wildflowers?
I have a few favorite, look, I have a lot of favorite wildflowers, but what I'm going to do is kind of marry the two and talk about spring beauty, which is a native wildflower that comes up in the spring, and by this time it's completely gone. So we've missed it for this year. But the interesting thing is it has a native bee that's specific only to this plant, and it's an adrenid bee. So this bee is a pollen specialist, and it only eats the pollen and nectar from the spring beauty wildflower. So if we don't have this wildflower, we won't have this bee. So that's the kind of thing that you have to think about in terms of habitat for insects. Some of it is broader, but some of it's really specific.
That's the
And how
ecosystem
wonderful.
view.
Yeah, and how wonderful that we have that right in New York City. You could see spring beauty in like every borough, and the bee has been shown to be in every borough too. They're not common. You have to get down on your hands and knees and look, but they are there.
10 seconds. Is it ever okay to pick wildflowers and put them in your living room vase or give them to your love?
Oh, no. Unless they're weeds or something not native. But especially if you're in a New York City park, there's rules against, look, we love them, but we love to look at them with our eyeballs and not pick them with our hands.
We leave it there with Marielle Anzalone. Again, in our monthly series, NYC Wild. She will be back with us in August. And thanks, Jessica Ware, entomologist and division chair of invertebrate zoology at the American Museum of Natural History and co-founder of Entomologists of Color. Great to have you on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so, on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people have bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.